Hi folks, welcome back to the Tabletop's Edge and another entry in our Op Sheets series where we discuss all things TCS. Last time out, I gave you my personal history with the TCS and stated rather unequivocally that this was one of my all-time favorite game series. So I thought it only fair to kind of explain to you specifically what it is about TCS that makes me hold it in such high regard. And that's kind of what we're going to do here today. Now, to begin with, I think we should probably define tactical level game or tactical gaming. And whenever I'm evaluating a game in terms of whether it's a tactical game or operational or strategic level, there are three main criteria that I'm looking at. The first is the size of the base units in the game. The second is the turn scale or time scale, and the third is map scale. Now, tactical gaming covers a rather broad spectrum, especially when it comes to timescales and map scales. For instance, on the map scale, hexes can represent anywhere from 25 to maybe 500 yards. And turn scales can run anywhere from a few minutes to a few hours that they represent. So I tend to kind of focus on the base unit size in determining whether or not something is truly a tactical game. For me, that's going to be units that are either squads or platoons for infantry, and either individual vehicles or platoons of vehicles when it comes to armor and vehicles. Now, you can stretch the definition of tactical up a little bit to include company-sized units. For instance, the GTS or Grand Tactical series from MMP has company-sized units. Is that a tactical level game or is that an operational level game? Well, it is the Grand Tactical game, and it certainly stretches the envelope when it comes to tactical level gaming, or at least the definition of that. The turns are 2 hours long. The hexes are 500 yards, so both of those do fall into what I normally consider a tactical level game, but really at the upper end. And the company-sized units, again, is really kind of pushing it. But I think what actually sort of tips the scales in favor of GTS being a tactical game versus an operational game is the fact that logistics are generally not an issue in tactical games, and GTS doesn't have really supply and logistics rules, much like TCS doesn't, nor any of the other tactical systems we'll probably mention today. So for me, a big tip off that you are getting into the operational level of gaming is you start to see rules and subsystems that deal with unit supply and logistics. So for instance, BCS. BCS has supply rules. OCS certainly has supply rules rather famously. So with games that don't have that, chances are you're looking at more of a tactical level game, all things being equal. Now, having defined what tactical level gaming is, I think you'll see that TCS does fall right kind of squarely in the middle of that spectrum of tactical games that we're talking about. We've got 20-minute game turns, we've got 125-yard hexes, and we've got platoons for our base unit sizes. Now, there have been a ton of tactical games published over the decades, but I think you'll find that more of them feature units that are squads versus platoon-sized units. In fact, just kind of off the top of my head, I'm thinking here primarily, well, basically just in terms of sort of World War II games. I know there are some additional modern games that I won't mention here that use platoons, but there aren't a heck of a lot of platoon-sized, if you will, or platoon-level World War II tactical games. Interestingly enough, one of the original tactical games, Panzer Blitz, used platoons, as did Panzer Leader, the sequel to that. Now, those are definitely classics, but seriously flawed games. However, considering the state of wargame design in the 1960s and early 70s, they really were good games for that era. And so I have a lot of respect for those designs. My father had both of those. I played those when I was very young, but did move on to more modern designs, particularly as the art of wargame design has evolved over the decades. I think we've seen better and better designs coming out of the industry. When you get to the 1980s, you had West End Games with their Tank Leader series. I believe there were 3 games in the series: East Front Tank Leader, West Front Tank Leader, and Desert Steel. Now, I never played these games, but from what I understand, they used some command cards to basically determine the order of actions within a given turn. And the games, I think, had kind of a mixed reception from players. There were some nice things about the games, and then there were some issues that they had. Another 80s game that featured platoons was Thunder at Casino. Now, this one I did buy and I did play. It is one of the so-called area impulse games that Avalon Hill published over the years. You know, in playing it, it was okay, but it didn't really, wow me. I think partly because certainly at the time I had this irrational prejudice against area movement games and point-to-point games. Now I still really don't care for point-to-point movement war games, but I've softened a little bit on area games if it's done properly. But Thunder Casino was, like I said, it was okay, but it felt much more like a game rather than maybe like a historical simulation. A couple of modern designs that feature platoons like TCS are Panzer Grenadier from Avalanche Press. Now, I have not played Panzer Grenadier, but I have taken a long, hard look at it over the years. I've had some interest in playing it, but the more I looked into it, the less interested I became in playing it. I don't think that's a system for me for a number of reasons. Briefly here, it looks to be a little bit too simple for my tastes. I tend to prefer the bigger, more complex games. In fact, I consider TCS to be relatively simple. It is one of the simpler games in my collection that I enjoy playing. It is by no means a simple game, but for me, I consider TCS pretty simple and straightforward. Panzer Grenadier is maybe like an order of magnitude less complex from what I have seen of the game. And there are a couple things in there that just kind of turned me off. The command system revolves around leader counters, and the way I understand those leader counters work just doesn't ring true for me when it comes to World War II tactical leadership. The rules seem a lot more appropriate for Napoleonic combat or ACW combat, something in the 19th century or 18th century, than it does for World War II. So for those reasons, Panzer Grenadier is it's really not on my to-do list. Now, another modern system that uses platoons that I have played and owned is Nations at War by Lock and Load Publishing. Now, a few years ago, I was looking for something in the tactical realm that was not that difficult, didn't have a lot of rules overhead, could play fairly quickly, and Nations at War sort of caught my eye. It sort of touted the fact that it has no combat results table, that everything you need to resolve combat is located, all the information is on the counters themselves. I was kind of intrigued by that, so I picked up White Star Rising, which is the sort of the Western Front, late war Western Front module in the Nations at War series, and was really kind of disappointed in my experience. I will say first off that as far as like the physical components go, beautiful game, really nice components. The counters, the information is laid out very clearly. They've got nice graphics on them, good colors. The maps are reasonably attractive. So you could tell that there's some quality put into that package. Unfortunately, the system was too simple for what I was looking for. I think, if I think Panzer Grenadier is a simple system, Nations at War is, I think, even simpler than that. But the real problem I had with the game was that it just didn't feel like a World War II tactical combat game. It was very generic, like really generic. The counter mix in the game had platoons of units, and they were grouped into generic battalions by type of battalion. So you would, for instance, have an American infantry battalion, or a German panzer battalion, or a British para battalion, but there was just one battalion of each type in the box. So there were 12 or 13 different battalions, but you only had one German panzer battalion. So you could never play a scenario that required two U.S. infantry battalions, for instance. And speaking of the scenarios, I found the scenarios to be very small, very bland, very generic, and just really not interesting. On top of that, it just didn't feel, like I said, like a World War II tactical combat game. So I was unfortunately disappointed with it, even though, like I said, it's from a physical standpoint, it is a quality product. It's just not for me. And likewise with Panzer Grenadier, you know, it's not for me, but there are a lot of people that really enjoy Panzer Grenadier. The game's been out, the thing's been around now, what, 2 decades? They've produced just a ton of content for it. It's got a very active community. So you don't have a game hang around for 20 plus years unless people are really enjoying it. And that's fantastic. I say more power to them. It's just not for me. So I guess you could say one reason why TCS is kind of my go-to tactical game is that the bar hasn't been set very high by the competition. But you know, it's much more than just the one-eyed man in the kingdom of the blind kind of a thing. There are some specifics about TCS, some unique features of TCS that really make it stand out compared to the other tactical combat systems I've seen. And now keep in mind, I am just talking about tactical games with platoon level counters, not squad level counters. So for instance, you know, I'm not talking about Advanced Squad Leader. I'm not talking about the Band of Brothers series or Clash of Heroes, because I don't think it's fair, and I don't think it's a good comparison to compare something where squads and maybe you've got 40 yards or 25 yards to the hex to a platoon level game where you're taking, you know, like you're sort of zooming out another level from the battle. So it's really an apples to oranges kind of thing. So there are several of the squad level games, you could call them, that I really do like. You know, I played ASL for a long time now. I really enjoy that. I'm just not to the point where ASL is a lifestyle game for me. There's too many other great games out there. So just in terms of platoon level games now, and again, there are not nearly as many of those, I think you'll find, as squad level games that have been published over the years. So with that said, let's take a look at what I really like about TCS. Number one, the unique command system. Now, TCS has the only type of command system like this that I've seen in any tactical game, both with squad and platoon sized units in them. And the most obvious feature of the command system in TCS is the op sheet. You can see I've got a couple of old op sheets here that I dug up out of the Black Wednesday game. And they're dominated by this large map graphic, and people tend to get sort of wrapped around the axle a little bit with op sheets. And really, all it boils down to is that it is a system, it is a written orders system supplemented by military-style graphics. The graphics are there to kind of give you some shorthand. You can see, you can plot out the axis of attack, the objectives here directly on a miniature reproduction of the larger map that you're going to be playing over. And the whole gist of the system is that it forces players to plan their operations before they execute them. These sheets of paper here are simply going to limit what your units, your individual playing pieces can do and where they can go on the map at any given time. That's kind of basically it. And the TCS rules do say, listen, if you want to, you can play without these or without the command system entirely and the game will work just fine. And it will, but the command system really is the heart of TCS, and if you take that out of the equation, you're missing an awful lot of what this design brings to the table. You can also make these what you want of them. You can make your op sheets as detailed as you want or as simple as you want. Now, they do say you don't want to just draw a gigantic arrow across the entire map and say attack east. That that kind of is getting around the spirit of the rules and what they're intended to do. They're putting the player in the role of a battalion or brigade commander and basically his staff. The command ratings that each side is given in a game is reflective of the historical efficiency of those command staffs. And what you tend to see over time is that the side with the better command ratings tends to be able to be more responsive to what's going on the map, more flexible. They're able to get more out of the units they have on map. And it's a pretty good representation of what was going on historically. Now, I'm not going to say it's realistic. Realism in war games is a whole thing that I will do a video on one day for sure. But what this does do is it helps put you at least in sort of that mindset of the historical counterparts whose role you're sort of filling in with these games. Now, I think it's very interesting that with just a couple of exceptions that I can think of, Frozen Hell and Omaha are the two that come to mind. Leadership is not represented on the map in TCS games at all. In Frozen Hell, I think the Finns have one leader counter, but since I have not yet played Frozen Hell, I'm not sure what his abilities or his effects on the game exactly are. For Omaha, there are a handful of regimental leaders, and there's a Norman Coda counter. Those are in the game due, one, to the extensive historical records of those specific leaders' actions during the amphibious landing and the time period covered by the game. And so placing them into the game as leaders on the map, they have a very limited effect on the overall game, but it's kind of an important one, and it's a nice historical one as well. But those really are the exceptions. Other than that, unlike really any other tactical system that even bothers with command and control, there are no leader counters on the map. And I think that's a real feather in TCS's cap and really does set it apart from the others. I think most games just don't really understand how tactical leadership at this scale really works. And so you've got other systems that are using more, say, traditional, for lack of a better word, game mechanics instead of maybe presenting something that, well, that it just works a lot better and is a little more historically accurate. In fact, the command rules, they really are much more than just drawing on the maps and writing some stuff down. They have some pretty important effects on the play of game, on the play of the game. I don't want to call them nuances or subtle effects, but they're just effects that aren't maybe readily apparent to you if you're just reading through the rules for the first time and you've never actually seen how everything works in action. So I think what I'm going to do is I will basically just dedicate one episode in this series to taking a deep dive on the command rules. On op sheets, we'll take a look at the different parts of an op sheet. We'll take a look at how the rules work. Again, it's not going to be from a tutorial standpoint, but more from an analysis standpoint. And for those of you that have never played TCS, maybe hopefully give you a better idea of what it's all about. Certainly better than you can get maybe from just reading the rules if you were able to find a copy online. So deep dive on the command system in TCS coming up at some point in the future. Number 2, a more historical mindset. I find that when I'm playing TCS as opposed to other tactical games, I tend to think about the game and what I'm doing in the game in more historical terms than game turns. For instance, I'm thinking in terms of objectives and missions versus playing pieces. So you're tending to look at the game maybe from a little bit higher level than just the standard individual pieces. You're planning in terms of formations. Very similar, I think, to the same kind of effect that BCS has. If you read my article, the BCS Primer, where I talk about thinking big, this game doesn't necessarily require you to think big, although it tends to sort of subtly sort of nudge you in that direction. And certainly, if you're going to get the most out of the units you have in any given game, you do want to tend to think in terms of battalions and companies, not just, well, where can I move this piece to do the most damage right now this turn. You're thinking when you're once you've got your plans together, you're thinking not so much in well, okay, I need to get 65 factors to get me on the next higher column on the CRT so I can be guaranteed of getting a successful attack here. You're thinking more in terms of I need to suppress the enemy because that's going to give my units more freedom of movement. And even though we're at the tactical level, it's still all about fire and maneuver. So you're thinking about how can I suppress the enemy to move in and then assault him, kick him out of his positions. You're not thinking, again, in terms of factor hunting, I like to call it, where, and this happens a lot in games that use any kind of odds-based CRT, where you're just scrounging the map for that one extra factor you can add in to your attack that's going to get you to that magical column on the CRT. None of that really is present in this game. And to me, that's a much more satisfying experience than playing what feels more like a game. Now, don't get me wrong, I enjoy those other kinds of games. You know, I just look at the amount of whiff content I have on my channel. That is a game that very much has an odds-based CRT, and in which you are trying to find every factor you can and squeeze it somehow into an attack to get you up on that attack column to where you can get the anything but a 1 attacks, or maybe even an automatic success. And it's a fun game. It's great for what it is. I just don't necessarily like that in my tactical games because it just doesn't feel right. Whiff is a great game, but it has its flaws, that's for sure. So when it comes to tactical gaming, TCS gives me this feeling of more historical verisimilitude, if you will, than really any other tactical system out there. Number 3, fire and movement rules that are pretty simple. The fire and movement rules, as I've alluded to before, are pretty straightforward and fairly simple. There's no big complex combat resolutions or complicated tables. TCS, unlike a lot of tactical games, doesn't necessarily focus on the technical specifications of the various hardware used. You find in so many tactical games just this really big emphasis on things like armor thickness, penetration of guns and tanks and whatnot, maximum ranges of small arms and squad automatic weapons. TCS is much more about the well, the command and control, to be quite frankly. It steps back from the sort of that spreadsheet, purely science approach to tactical game, and I think it takes it gives you a better look at what happened and why when it comes to these historical battles that the system covers. If the command system is the heart of the series rules, the action phase is really the heart of each individual turn. There's an initial command phase where you are dealing with things regarding your op sheets and command-related items, planning and whatnot. Then you have an aircraft and artillery phase where you're kind of resolving air sorties and artillery barrages, and then you get into the action phase. And this is where those sides are going to move and shoot. And it's a pretty free-form phase in the turn. It's not a real procedurally spelled out portion of the turn. For instance, there's no prep fire phase, then movement phase, then defensive fire phase, then close assault phase. None of that. All of that is rolled into the action phase, and you can move, shoot, and assault with your units in any order you like within the bounds of the rules. And what that produces is a pretty good pace of play. It feels a lot more organic and natural. It runs rather smoothly. You can there's a lot of different ways you can do this. One of the few restrictions is once you start moving a stack or a unit, you need to finish that unit's movement for the turn before you move on to something else. The exception to that, though, is vehicles. With version 4.0, the 4th edition, they have now given vehicles 3 impulses within the action phase, and in each of those impulses they can spend up to 1/3 of their movement allowance. So it's possible for you to move a vehicle, go on and move some other pieces somewhere else, come back to the vehicle for its second impulse, where it can either fire or it can move again, do any number of things. And I'll talk a little bit more about the vehicle stuff later in this video, but the turns don't feel as chopped up as they do in a lot of other systems, where you're required to, everybody moves and then everybody shoots, everybody rallies, and so on and so forth. It's up to you, and this is where you can get down into the nitty-gritty details of the real tactical stuff if you want. But I just really like the way the turns flow, and the fact that combat resolution is quick and fast. Even artillery resolution now. So it wasn't true back in the 1st and 2nd, really even kind of the 3rd editions of the rules, but they've been constantly streamlining those artillery rules over the years to make artillery resolution proceed a lot faster, not really bog the game down. Also, they've taken out a lot of the dice rolls within the turn for things like Overwatch that used to be in the game, and I think they've made a lot of really good improvements to the system over the years without adding a bunch of rules that kind of bog things down. You see sometimes in games follow-on additions, new editions of games will fix some problems or attempt to fix some problems by adding more rules, and a lot of times those rules just tend to bog down the pace of play. But that is not the case here in TCS, and I'm happy to report that the fast pace of play, the sort of free-form action phases, really do provide a good pace of play, while giving you, the player, the ability to kind of feel like you are conducting actual operations, actual missions with the units, rather than simply running through a procedural step-by-step kind of thing. Number 4, the fire table. Now you can see here, this is the 4th edition of the TCS charts, and we're on the fire resolution page. Here you can see just a bit of the morale table down at the bottom, but this section right here is the fire table, and this includes, as you can see, resolution for both area fire and point fire. So there are 2 types of fire in the TCS system. There's area fire, which is generally sort of small arms or high explosive shots, and then there's point fire, which is more of your anti-tank. It's fire versus a specific target, like a vehicle, usually sometimes a gun, like an anti-tank gun, something along those lines. Well, both types of fire have now, with this new 4th edition, been incorporated into the same table here. What I like about this fire table is that there's a very wide range of outcomes. As you can see, it goes anywhere from no effect all the way down to 9 step losses. And keep in mind, a full-strength infantry platoon in this series is generally 5 steps. So you can end up shooting at a particular target and having no effect whatsoever, or potentially killing 8 or 9 steps. Now, obviously, the wider range of results comes in as you move further up to the right on the chart. So your small, less effective fires are going to be happening down here on the left end, and the really effective stuff is over here on the right end. Now, some people may not like that spread of results. They may think, well, it's a little dicey, it's a little gamey, who knows what could happen if you run into a really hot streak by your opponent while you go ice cold. It can be a pretty one-sided exchange. Though, and that is true, there are times where you can really get your head handed to you if the dice get ice cold and simultaneously red hot for your opponent over the course of several rolls. One nice thing that I will say is that the critical luck in TCS, because of the fact that there are so many dice rolls, is really kind of lessened. But as far as the wide range of results, I actually think that's a feature, not a bug. What it does is it allows the opportunity for heroic or unlikely events to occur. The types of things that you read about all the time in accounts of tactical level combat in this time period. You never know when an Audie Murphy is going to show up in that hex, and you just hope that he's on your side and he's not on the enemy side when he does show up. But it's a really kind of a neat feature of the fire table, and I think it really adds to the narrative. These games are superb with the narrative that they tell. You'll also note that as you move up or to the right on the fire table, there's a little bit of a loss of efficiency as you add more and more fire points to the attack. So as you are adding more factors, and basically what you'll do is every unit has a fire factor. You'll be adding that along with some modifiers that you can see up here. Again, none of these tables are particularly big. There's not a ton of modifiers that you're doing. So the calculations for fire combat are pretty quick and easy, particularly once you have a little bit of experience with the system. But what you'll find is if you double the amount of firepower that you're pouring into a hex in an attack, that doesn't necessarily mean you can expect double the damage inflicted. I think Lee Forrester said it was something on the order of about 1.4 increase in damage when you double your firepower. So what this does is it kind of gives you diminishing returns, if you will, as you move to the right and move further up this table. Yes, when you get over here, you dump enough firepower in there, you're going to get better results most of the time than you will if you're down here on the left side. But if you look at it in terms of what am I getting for each firepower factor that I've committed to this big massive attack, it's really less than maybe what you could get had you split those firepower factors up into more attacks. And so essentially what this fire table does is it encourages a higher number of smaller fire attacks rather than these big, massive combined fires, which really at this scale were pretty rare historically. Now, sometimes you may need to mass a bunch of firepower to try to get a decent effect on some infantry that are dug in protective terrain. Sure, that's going to happen sometimes. But what I'm saying is in the normal course event, that's not the normal tactic that you're going to want to use to be truly successful in this system. So again, I like the fire table both from the fact that it's quick and easy to use. It's got a wide range of results, which I think reflects the chaos of tactical level combat very nicely, but without bogging down into a lot of details and chrome. And it really does give you a nice narrative to the game as you're going along. Number 5, specific terrain and orders of battle. Unlike a lot of systems, including Advanced Squad Leader, although I'm not, again, comparing TCS to ASL necessarily because they're apples to oranges, but for instance, Panzer Grenadier, where you have generic counters and geomorphic maps and scenarios that are historically based in TCS. Each TCS game covers a specific historical battle. So the result of that is you get a map that has the actual historical terrain of that fight. You get the orders of battle specific to that action. And I will say that the historical research is at a very high level for the designs in this system, which is nice. The maps are both functional and I think for the most part pretty attractive. Again, the big problem I had with certainly Nations at War was it was just so generic and bland. It just didn't really feel like anything. I could have been refighting the Battle of the Bulge just as easily as I could have been fighting an invasion of Mars with Nations at War rules. You know, I've always really liked the historical ASL modules because while I enjoy ASL with their geomorphic map boards and their generic pieces, the scenarios, I think many scenarios are extremely well done in that game, very entertaining. But the historical ASL modules are nice because it gives you an opportunity to play ASL on the historical terrain, or at least the historical terrain that's been conformed to ASL standards. It's a really nice touch. Additionally, the different battles in this TCS series present a different challenge and really have a different flavor. This series has games right now that range all the way from the frozen Arctic to steamy Guadalcanal and the desert. And you're looking at actions that take place anywhere from 1939 to 1944 in on the East Front, the West Front, the Mediterranean, and even the Pacific. So there are a number of different types of battles and actions that are represented in the series. Matter of fact, that's not even taking into account Semper Fi, which goes into Korea, and the hopefully soon to be released Goose Green, which brings us all the way up to the Falkland Islands War in 1982. So there's a wide variety within the series, and yet each one is specific to that particular subject matter, which gives you a much better appreciation and understanding of that historical topic than you can really get from the more generic systems out there. Number 6, detailed artillery rules. Now, this one is not as applicable now as it was back when I first discovered the game. That was one of the two things, aside from the op sheets mechanic, that really jumped out at me, was the detail that they had in the artillery system. Now, the newer editions have kind of dumbed down the artillery rules. Well, you know, I guess that's not really fair. Dumbed down. They've simplified the artillery rules and they've streamlined them. And I'm kind of torn about the artillery changes. You know, I am all in favor of rules changes that have been made that favor a faster resolution to artillery fire. That's one of the things in the older editions. Resolving artillery missions could take a little while and involved a lot of dice rolling. That was actually kind of a theme of, I think, the series in the early editions, was a lot of dice rolling. That's been cut down, I think, and it's generally for the better. But at the same time as making artillery fire resolution faster and better, they've also increased the flexibility of artillery, which I'm not as enthusiastic about. Sure, from a playability standpoint, it's fantastic, but you lose a little bit of that feeling that those earlier editions gave you that I really liked. For instance, initially, when you drew up an op sheet, like we see here under the task organization, you'd have to list the fire support in terms of which artillery batteries were going to be supporting this particular op sheet. Your artillery batteries could either be in direct support or in general support. Now, a direct support artillery battery had to be listed on the op sheet and was only available to be called in by units that were listed on that same op sheet. A general support artillery battery was not listed on any particular op sheet and was therefore could be called in by anyone. So it was a little more flexible. So why would you ever go with a direct support battery versus a general support battery? Well, back in those earlier editions of the rules, they had what they termed a called fire delay. This to not get too deep into the weeds here, on let's say the 0600 turn during the artillery phase, you would plot where you wanted to call in a particular battery fire on the map. The resolution would not occur until the artillery phase of the 0620 turn. Now, if you had a called fire delay of, say, 1 turn, what would happen is you would plot the artillery on the 0600 turn. The 0620 turn, it would not be resolved. The called fire would be reduced by 1 turn to 0 in this case. And then on the 0640 turn in the artillery phase, that's when the rounds would start landing. So what you have is a direct support battery was more responsive to a more restricted number of units because they were basically on call for those specific guys, whereas your general support batteries would take a little bit longer to coordinate, and therefore it took a little bit longer for them to actually get to the point where they were throwing rounds in support of what you needed them to do, but they could answer anybody's call for help. So that's kind of an idea of how the artillery rules have sort of been evolving over the years. And like I said, the early versions of the artillery rules were really kind of neat and very unique within, I think, the tactical wargaming space. But they did have their issues. They were a bit lengthy and involved and sort of time-consuming to get through. So, again, I'm not saying the new artillery rules are worse. In many ways, they're a lot better. But I just kind of miss some of the stuff that the early versions of those rules gave us. Number 7, how it handles combined arms. Now, in TCS, tanks are not just stronger, faster infantry like I've seen in a lot of other games, and this is not just a problem on the tactical level either. It's also a problem on the operational level, and to a lesser extent on the strategic level, but particularly on the operational level. Anyway, tanks are also not invulnerable to infantry in this system. Terrain is so very important as to the effectiveness of your armored vehicles. Now, certainly, ideally, you want to get armor and infantry working together, but it's not like there's some magical rule that if you stack these two things together, then something awesome happens. Rather, it's the simple effects of the different types of units, both in fire and movement, that sort of just organically come together to make your force more effective. And when I talk about terrain, infantry caught out in the open by tanks is going to be in trouble, especially if they get suppressed. It's going to be a real long day for those guys. Likewise, if you're bringing tanks into partly protective or protective terrain by themselves without some infantry alongside them, they can be very vulnerable to enemy infantry. And it reminds me of a story a buddy of mine told me back in college about a friend of his grandfather's who fought in the Second World War. He was an infantryman, and they were in France sometime in '44. The infantry unit, they were like marching down a road back out of a village, and a Sherman tank pulls up and stops, and a guy pops out of the hatch and goes, "Is it safe?" Meaning the village down the road. And so he was just kind of struck by sort of the incongruity of this guy in this giant steel box with this massive gun on it, asking this poor little infantryman if it was safe down the road in that village. But I think anybody anybody with tanker experience who's watching this can probably relate to the question. And I think that well represented in this TCS series with the way they handle combined arms. So that's number 7. Number 8, close assaults are a big deal. Now, close assaults where you move into the opponent's hex and resolve combat there is it's very chancy, but tactical combat, especially at this level, is chaotic. You never know when there's an Audie Murphy that's going to pop up in that hex, and so it's not to be undertaken lightly, and you've got to do the best you can to kind of prepare for any close assault. You just can't go firing them off randomly or casually, because you will generally get burnt by them. But sometimes you've got infantry that's dug in protective terrain, and the only way to get them out of there most of the time is to have to go in there and dig them out by close assault, and it can be costly, which historically it was. Again, this is another nice aspect of this game. It sort of puts the close assaults in what I think is a proper perspective here. One of the little things I like, so we talked earlier about the suppression and close assault is kind of what you're thinking and what you're trying to achieve when you're on the attack against an objective. Ideally, you suppress the enemy. They're unable to fire at your troops then as at your assaulting troops as the assaulting troops move up and get close. However, when the assaulting troops go in for the close assault, for the first round of that close assault, the suppression marker is removed. And I really like this little touch, because what's happening, or what happens in the real world, is as your maneuver element is closing over the last 50 to 75 meters to the objective where the enemy is located, your base of fire is going to lift and shift their fire off of the objective so as not to hit your guys that are assaulting and running, overrunning the enemy. In that brief time, that's going to give the enemy a chance to kind of pop their heads back up. So the suppression is there to keep the enemy's heads down and keep them from shooting at your guys as they get close. But that last little bit, they'll have an opportunity to fire in an unsuppressed mode in that first round of close assault, which again is a nice little touch. Now, close assaults in this game can be attritional, but they're not drawn out. In other words, you're not going to move into a hex in an action phase and start a close assault combat, kill a couple of steps on each side, and then next turn still be in that same hex, whittling away each side for 2 or 3 or 4 turns. No, when you go into close assault, that's it. It's going to come to a decision right then and there. It may take you a couple rounds of shooting back and forth at one another, but either one side is going to be wiped out or be chased off, fail some kind of morale check, and be driven out of the hex, which again is a nice feeling to it. The close assaults are decisive one way or the other usually, and while they're costly, sometimes you just can't avoid them, and they're the only way to kind of get the job done, which again is a nice reflection of tactical combat, I think, in this time period. Too many games, I think, allow players to sort of sit back at range and just sort of blast away, and eliminate the defenders that way, when that really wasn't how things were done. So, close assaults, fun, nerve-wracking, and decisive. Number 9, vehicle morale rules. Actually, probably all the vehicle rules. Now, these vehicle morale rules are new with version 4.0. The 4th edition really overhauled almost every aspect of how vehicles are handled, from movement to combat to morale, and even command and how they're handled on op sheets. Morale, we're looking here at an updated German morale sheet for the GD40 game. You can see this game was published back when they were using company morale. You would track morale by company versus battalion. Here you can see we've got the 3 battalions, the 3 infantry battalions of Grossdeutschland represented, along with 2 battalions of the 69th Schützen Regiment and the Sturm Pioneer Battalion. And then down here we have the vehicle battalions. And the way vehicle morale works is a little bit different than infantry morale, but essentially every time a unit or a step is lost in that battalion, you'll place a marker here on one of the circles or the square here. Now, when you place a vehicle counter on the square, you'll see at number 1, that will increase the battalion morale of the vehicle battalion. You'll roll 1d6. If you roll equal to or less than that number, the battalion has basically failed its morale check. They are going to have to execute then their failure instructions of whatever op sheet they're on. So they're generally pulled back to wherever. Now, once they do that, they're unassigned. They can begin, you can attempt to give them new orders, if you will. And the vehicles accrue these new orders 3 times faster than infantry formations do. So it's entirely likely that you will see units or formations, vehicle formations, kind of run into combat, get shot up a bit, fall back, take a little while to get reorganized, and come back in and either rejoin an op sheet or somehow rejoin whatever attack or defense happens to be underway. So I think it's a really nice way to sort of reflect the higher operations tempo of mechanized units, and to do so within the really largely original framework of the TCS system. So if you recall from last episode, I talked about the discussion raging kind of in the mid to late 90s about the issues TCS had regarding vehicles, and it looks to me, at least in the experience I have with the 4th edition rules, looks like they've really done an excellent job of fixing a lot of that stuff. They feel like mechanized units. They don't, like I said, they don't feel like just bigger, stronger infantry units. I really like how it all kind of plays together. So vehicle rules in general, especially the way the vehicle morale rules work, is another big plus for TCS. Now, To this point, I've been selling TCS pretty hard, and I am a bit of a realist. And even though I really do like this game, I've yet to find a game that does not have some flaws. And TCS is not without issues. I think the biggest one is also the one that, to me, is what really sets it apart from everything else, and that's the command rules. The command rules can be problematic if you're not playing solo or with a neutral umpire, because even like-minded players will have differing interpretations of the orders. I've come across this not just in TCS, but also in the Civil War Brigade series, also by the gamers, which has a written orders system. And just to give you an example of a potential problem here, this is an op sheet for Gross Deutschland 40 for the French. They've set up it's a hasty defense, and basically they've got 3 companies of the 3rd Battalion of the 205th Infantry Regiment out here defending forward of the village of Stone, where they've got the 1st and 2nd Battalion along with a tank company there. Now the orders are to defend forward in the various positions as long as possible, and then they are to withdraw to this phase line here, phase line Cherry, which is along the top of the escarpment there. And the failure instructions are, as you can see, they're to fall back to the southwest of Stone, and the rally point is located in this hex here where the X is located. Now, seems fairly straightforward, right? And the game does, though, require a bit of common sense and some honesty, intellectual honesty, we'll say. Here's what that looks like actually on the map. So here's the 3rd Company, 1st Company, 2nd Company in their various defensive positions. Now, as the Germans come and attack, at some point these guys are probably going to be overwhelmed just by sheer numbers, and they're going to have to fall back to that phase line Cherry, which runs along here. Now, the Germans will more than likely be pursuing them up here. At some point, they're going to get shot up. They'll probably end up having to fall back. Now, let's say they are, they retreat back to here, and there's really little hope of them being able to hold on to this phase line back here, essentially this fallback position. If the French player were to accept reality and say, okay, they have failed in their missions, I need to institute the failure instructions and withdraw them back here, they will become unassigned. Units that are unassigned in this series have a number of disadvantages to them. So players really, you don't want to have units unassigned if you can possibly avoid that. So at what point is a straggling remnant of the battalion that's sort of clinging to the backside of the hill here, say a quarter a mile or more away from their defensive line, at what point are they no longer able to fulfill their mission? You see where this you can see how that opens up a very legitimate question that is subject to interpretation. And like I said, the consequences for being on an active implemented op sheet versus being unassigned are noticeable in this game. And there's no hard and fast black and white mechanism to say when or whether a particular unit has failed its assignment. And that is, not an inconsiderable issue with the game, and it's certainly something to keep in mind, particularly if you haven't played TCS and you're thinking, man, this looks awesome, can't wait to get my hands on this. Just be aware that this is a situation that's going to arise. There's a reason you don't see many DNESIG games at competitive tournaments like World Board Game Championships. The designs are excellent, but they're not necessarily suited for competitive play. I'd say competitive play, obviously anyone, when we sit down to play a game, we're playing to win, but there's the sort of the tournament winning, and then there's just winnings. Yes, I tend to play more for the experience, but hey, I'm also trying to win the game. So it's an issue that I don't think has found a really satisfactory solution, and I don't know if it will. So just be advised that this issue is out there, and even, like I said, very like-minded individuals. The longtime gaming partner and I, we see eye to eye on most things, not just inside gaming, but outside of gaming. Even we have had heated discussions about the interpretation of various written orders in CWB, to a lesser extent here in TCS. But it is an issue. Another thing with TCS is that artillery is important in the system, but it's maybe not as destructive as it should be. The early editions had certainly a very detailed artillery resolution procedure, which went into a lot of the process, the actual real world process, or at least reflected that kind of stuff, which was a nice touch. But I don't know if maybe artillery might be a little understated in the system. Granted, it is still pretty effective. And it works just fine. It does, the game plays fine. I just wonder if maybe, certainly reading historical accounts or studies, sometimes the artillery in TCS feels like it's maybe not living up to the historical record. But certainly not to the point where I can definitely say, oh yeah, the artillery is way underrated in this game, or it's way too strong, anything like that. The third issue that I would raise would be replayability. It can be somewhat limited because each game in the system is on a specific historical battle. You have a specific map, you have a specific OB, and you have a certain number of scenarios. Generally, it's 5 to maybe a dozen different scenarios. We're looking here at GD40, and you can see it's one map. And this is the setup for the 4.1 scenario, the first scenario, which then also can be used as the starting point for the full campaign. And there are probably only so many ways you can, as the Germans, attack and capture stone or defend it, given what you have. Now, this game not only does it have, I think, 5 or 6 scenarios, but it does have a number of variants, because there were a number of units in the near vicinity that were unengaged that could possibly or reasonably have been called in and participated in the battle. There's also an option to extend it beyond the 15th through, I think, the late afternoon of the 16th, so turn it into more of a 2-day battle here, and then additional units will show up on that second day. But for some of the smaller games, certainly, the replayability factor might be a little bit more limited, certainly more limited than something like Panzer Grenadier, where in the East Front Deluxe box, I think the second edition of that, there's something like 115 scenarios. So certainly ASL has thousands of scenarios. You can play ASL, you can play a new scenario every single day of your life with ASL, and it would probably take you 10 years to get through the current catalog. So again, that's an issue. I tend to think there's enough gameplay in each box, to justify the cost. And in an ideal world, we're seeing TCS games come out, once a year. That would be great. Maybe twice a year, like we did back in the 90s. Although I think maybe once a year might be a little bit better, because give you a little more time with each game before the next new shiny thing comes out. Speaking of which, Goose Green is currently still up on pre-order at MMP's website, and as of today, June 2nd, it's sitting at 525 pre-orders out of 550. We only need 25 more. So if you think TCS is something that might interest you, Goose Green could be a really nice entry to the system for you. It's only one map. It's only 140 counters total, so that's half a counter sheet. The longest, it's got 6 scenarios. 2 of them are sort of the full battle. One's 39 turns, one's a hypothetical sort of setup with 40 turns, and I think the shortest scenario is 5 turns in length. So if you're challenged for table space, it's a single map. If you don't have a lot of time, there are some short scenarios, and it's a very low counter density, and it's only $24. So $24 is the pre-order price. I mean, that's basically a large pizza with 4 toppings on it, right? For the cost of that, you could get the latest and greatest with TCS. It comes with the latest 4th edition rules, 4th edition charts. And if we can get Goose Green to its pre-order number, we can hopefully show MMP that TCS does have an audience out here. There is demand for this, and they can hopefully get this system off of life support, and we can start seeing more excellent games in the series come out. Now, I know Goose Green, Falkland Islands is maybe not everybody's cup of tea. They also have some bagged copies of Ariete, which is another small game. It's the Italian defensive Bureau Gubi in, I think, November 1942 during Crusader. It is, again, a one-mapper. It is a very armor-heavy game, but again, these 4th edition rules have really radically changed how TCS handles vehicles. So if you're a desert fan, maybe that's the one to look at. That one's only $36, and it's got, I think it's one map. I think it is a full counter sheet in that one, and there are several scenarios there. So there are a couple of really good, inexpensive options to get into this series. And again, if they sell out of Ariete and they sell out of GD42, that, by the way, is just a fantastic game. And again, at $54, it's a steal. There is so much game in that. It is an interesting topic, interesting battle, real back and forth. You've got some good units on both sides. It is among the larger TCS games. It's 3 maps, but it's only 3 counter sheets, so there's lots of room for maneuver. And a nice OB, like I said, for both sides. You've got infantry as well as armor at play there. So I know I'm pushing TCS hard here, and it is not. I am not. It's not at the behest of MMP. I'm getting no remuneration from them. Haven't had any contact from them. I'm doing this basically as a fan of the system, sort of making this appeal to either old TCS players out there who kind of walked away from the system like I did. I urge you to come back and give this 4th edition a shot. And you've got a couple of, like I said, inexpensive, readily available options to do that. So with that, I will leave you all today. Thanks again for watching, and till next time, take care. We'll see you then.